My name is Rachel. I'm 22 years old, and what I'm about to tell you is something I've kept secret until now. It is the story of how my seemingly quiet life in Bristol was turned upside down. I've always considered myself a reserved, rule-following person. I grew up in a loving family with parents who always gave me everything I needed. My father, Edward, is a respected man known for his loyalty and honesty. My mother, Margaret, is a kind and caring woman, a true keeper of the home. I have never lacked for anything, but there was nothing I could call truly exciting until he came along. Andrew arrived in the spring, bringing with him an aura of mystery and charisma that took over the space around him. He was an old college friend of my father Edward, and they had had countless adventures in their youth. My father often spoke of Andrew with admiration, describing him as a man who fearlessly embraced life and had an innate sense of calm. This story made his arrival all the more intriguing. He was a longtime friend of my father, whom he always referred to as a man of peace. Andrew had spent years abroad, exploring places I could only imagine in movies, and now he was back for a short visit. My father insisted on welcoming him into our home, and that's where it all began. From the moment he crossed the threshold, I felt something had changed. Andrew was exactly as my father had described him: tall, confident, with gray hair that only added to his charm. He had a smile that seemed to answer all the questions in the world. Conversations with him flowed easily, and he had the ability to capture the attention of everyone in the room. For my father, it was a joy to share stories with an old friend. For me, however, Andrew was something new, almost mesmerizing. He seemed interested in everything I said. He asked me about my studies, about the books I loved, and even about little things that no one seemed to notice before. For the first time, I felt like someone saw me as more than just Edward's daughter. He saw Rachel. But that wasn't all that happened that night. There was a moment I can't forget. While my father was completely absorbed in watching the soccer game, Andrew and I were alone in the kitchen. He talked about his travels with such passion, describing the landscapes and culture, that it was impossible not to drown in his words. And then he did something that took me by surprise. He looked into my eyes, held my gaze for a few seconds, and said, "There's something special about you, Rachel. I rarely meet women like you." For a moment, my breath caught. I tried to hide my emotions, pretending it was just an innocent compliment, but something about his words and the way he said it made me feel tension in the air, something new I'd never experienced before. And so it began. His presence, which seemed like just a friendly visit, quickly escalated into something more complicated that I knew I couldn't control. I couldn't stop thinking about his words. They played over and over in my head like a melody impossible to forget. After that night, something in me changed. Andrew stayed in our house, and every step he took, every look he gave me made my heart beat faster. I tried to convince myself that it was just a fantasy, that such thoughts were unacceptable, but the more I tried to push them away, the more they came back. Father was busy as usual, either in the garden or with his papers. He didn't notice that things were beginning to change between Andrew and me, but I did. Andrew found an excuse to talk to me every chance he got. Sometimes it was a simple question like, "How was your day?" or "What's your favorite book?" But behind those innocent words was something more, something that could not be put into words. One day, when we were alone in the living room, he talked about his past, about how many countries he had traveled to. Those travels had changed him. I listened to him without taking my eyes off him. His voice was mesmerizing, and his stories awakened something in me. "Then maybe I should stay here longer," he said with a smile. "I think I've found a grateful listener." The next day something special began to happen. When my father left for a few hours on business, Andrew suggested we have coffee on the terrace. I agreed, trying not to show how much I cared about his proximity. We sat side by side, enjoying the spring sunshine, and he started talking about his travels again. "Do you ever dream of seeing the world?" he asked, looking at me as if he knew I wanted to say something. Sure, sometimes I feel like I'm stuck here within these walls, I admitted. I was surprised at my candor. That's easy to fix, he replied. It just takes a little courage. His words sounded so simple, but they made a deep impression on me. I sensed that he wasn't just talking about traveling. That night, when my father stayed overnight at a friend's house, Andrew and I were alone in the house. I was sitting in the kitchen trying to finish reading a book, but my thoughts were far from the page. Andrew walked into the room, poured himself some water, and sat down next to me. "You seem kind of broody today," he said, watching me. "Just tired," I lied, hoping he wouldn't notice my agitation. But he did notice. His eyes stopped on mine, and I felt the silent tension between us. I knew this moment would change everything, but I couldn't stop myself. After that night, the tension between us had become almost unbearable. Every glance was imbued with some hidden meaning. Andrew found new ways to be closer to me, and though I tried to maintain a semblance of indifference, I couldn't ignore what I was feeling. One evening, when my father was visiting friends again, Andrew offered to help me in the kitchen. We were cooking dinner together, and the atmosphere between us was both relaxed and filled with electricity. "You're always so focused when you're chopping vegetables," he joked, standing very close to me. "It's important," I replied with a slight smile. He stepped closer, and I felt the warmth of his body. When I reached for the knife, our hands accidentally made contact. It was only an instant, but it made me freeze. Andrew didn't pull away. We continued cooking, but the tension only grew. After dinner, Andrew poured us each a glass of wine and suggested we sit on the terrace. The night was warm, and the moonlight illuminated everything around us. "You know," he began, looking at me, "you're extraordinary." I was confused. I didn't know what to say in response. His words sounded sincere, but there was more to them than a simple compliment. "You say that to everyone," I tried to lighten the mood. "No, only to those who deserve it." Andrew reached for my hand, and I felt his fingers lightly touch mine. It was so unexpected, so intimate, I couldn't hold back a shiver. "If you want me to stop, just say so," he said, but his look said he was hoping for a different answer. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. It was like acquiescence, and he understood me without words. His face was so close I could feel his breath, and then he leaned in and kissed me gently. The kiss was soft, but it felt like the passion he'd been holding back all these days. I didn't resist. On the contrary, I responded to him, letting everything that was happening carry me away. When we pulled away, I felt reality come over me in a wave. It felt so wrong, but in that moment, I couldn't think about anything but him. I knew there was no going back, but at that moment it seemed like the only right thing to do. The next day started as usual, but inside me, it was different. Andrew and I avoided each other, as if we were afraid to face the truth. I felt like our bond was crossing all boundaries, but I couldn't bring myself to break it. When my father suddenly left for London on business, leaving us alone for the weekend, the situation escalated. The house, filled with silence, seemed too big for the two of us. Every sound, every step Andrew made in the hallway reminded me of what had happened. That evening I sat on the couch, trying to concentrate on my book, but my thoughts kept returning to him. As if sensing my unease, Andrew walked into the living room. "You look pensive," he said, sitting down next to me. I lifted my head and met his gaze. His presence once again captured my full attention. "Just thinking a lot," I replied, trying to hide my embarrassment. "Me too," he admitted, "about last night." My hands trembled, and I put the book aside. His words sounded like a challenge. I didn't know if I wanted to continue, but I couldn't stop. "Andrew," I started, but he interrupted me. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said quietly, but with such confidence that it sounded like a confession. A tense silence hung between us again. His hand gently touched my cheek, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I closed my eyes, letting myself feel the moment. He leaned closer, and I felt his lips on mine. It was a kiss that was a mix of passion, prohibition, and desire. Everything inside me screamed that this was wrong, but I couldn't stop. As the kiss grew deeper, Andrew whispered softly, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I nodded, realizing that I had already crossed a line beyond which there was no going back. We made our way up to the second floor, and I was shaking with mixed feelings. I walked into my room, Andrew followed me, the door closed behind us, and everything that happened next was a blur. It was a moment full of feeling, passion, and recklessness. But when the dream ended, reality caught up with me. I lay staring at the ceiling, feeling guilt and fear overwhelm me. Andrew put his arm around me, but it didn't bring relief. "Are you okay?" he asked me. "I don't know," I whispered, trying to realize what we had done. I knew this moment had changed me. My heart was torn between the guilt I felt for my father and the emotions I felt for Andrew. After that night, everything changed. I could no longer look at myself in the mirror without feeling a weight of guilt. The morning started out rough. The sunlight streaming through the curtains didn't bring relief. Andrew was still around, but his presence only added to my inner turmoil. "Good morning," he said quietly, running his hand through my hair. I nodded, not daring to look at him. All I felt was the weight of what we'd done. "We need to talk," I finally said, sitting down on the bed. He sat down next to me, his expression serious but calm. "I know," he replied. "I've been thinking about it too." We both realized that what had happened had changed us, but how to move on with our lives. I couldn't let this ruin my family. "It was a mistake," I said, trying not to show emotion. Andrew was silent for a moment, then nodded. "If that's the way you feel, I'll leave. It's what's best for everyone." Those words sounded like a release, but at the same time, I felt hurt. His decision was the right one, but it hurt me. All day long we avoided each other. I tried to focus on household chores, but everything in the house reminded me of him. His voice, his touch, it all kept living in my head. When my father returned from his trip, I tried to act natural. The three of us had dinner, and I tried my best to keep the conversation light. But Andrew was silent, as if he was mentally preparing to leave. The next day he started packing. I watched him stow his suitcase and felt my insides clench. "Are you sure this is the best way to leave?" he asked before closing the suitcase. "Yes," I replied, though my voice was shaking. It was the right thing to do. As he said goodbye to my father, I stood back, trying not to show my emotions. But when Andrew came up to me to say goodbye, I couldn't hold back the tears. "Take care of yourself," he whispered, hugging me goodbye. I only nodded, feeling him leave, taking a part of me with him. After he left, the house seemed empty. My father didn't suspect anything, and that both comforted and tormented me at the same time. I realized that I now had to focus on rebuilding my life, but the sense of loss wouldn't let go. Every time I thought of Andrew, a warm but painful feeling arose in my chest. I couldn't deny that he meant more to me than I wanted to admit, but I also knew what it meant to destroy everything I had. It took a few months before I was able to come to my senses. Each meeting with my father became more and more difficult for me. We lived under the same roof, but I felt that there was more and more distance between us. I began to seek solace in everyday life, distracted by work and household chores. However, thoughts of Andre did not leave me. I often recalled our last conversation, when he said that this would be our secret. I realized that this moment determined my whole future path. Memories of what happened, and the fact that it was a mistake became a part of me. When my father suggested a vacation abroad, I realized that it could be a chance to start over. I said yes, but in the back of my mind, I felt that I was not completely free of guilt. By going to another country, I tried to start fresh. My father and I spent unforgettable time together, traveling, walking around the new city. but every moment I was tormented by thoughts of what had happened. I no longer felt the same desire that had driven me to Andrew, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized that this story wasn't over for me. I continued to see the world differently, to see people differently, and perhaps that was the main lesson I was about to learn, that every action has consequences, even if they are not always immediately apparent. In the meantime, the connection with Andrew had broken, and I realized that it had been the right choice. There were periods of loneliness, but I began to appreciate the moments with my father more. Gradually, I regained the closeness I had lost. The realization came to me late, but perhaps it was because of these mistakes that I became more aware of how important honesty, love, and respect are in relationships. One day, sometime later, I sat down with my father and told him that I wanted to be honest with him about what I was going through. I wanted to rebuild the trust and relationship that he and I had lost. "You are important to me," I told him, "and I want to be the best daughter I can be to you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of the months I had been going through. I knew I would work on myself to be the kind of dependable person I wanted to be. This experience, with its unexpected twists and turns and mistakes, was a lesson for me. I will never forget what happened, and it will probably remain my inner secret. But in that moment, I realized that the most important thing is not to let the past ruin the present. My life returned to normal, but with the realization that every choice has consequences, and now I knew I had to be careful to respect myself and those I love. Life goes on, and although I have put this chapter behind me, it will always remind me of the importance of trust and loyalty.